Thank you for joining us again for our weekly town hall, Smart Justice during COVID-19. Tonight we're having a conversation with some folks that I think you all know, outstanding individuals who are doing a lot of work in the community and it's having an impact. Tonight we're going to discuss protests and the impact of police divestment on mass incarceration. As many of you know, there has been a call to defund the police, divest from the police. And so I just want to talk a little bit about that briefly before I have my panelists introduce themselves. And so from their inception, police have been tasked with protecting power and privilege by exerting social control over Black people. That racist history is the broken foundation that our modern policing institution is grounded in. The epidemic of police violence in this country is not an issue of bad apples. Modern policing is rotten at its core. Police in America are empowered to act as an occupying force in low-income communities and communities of color across the country. Black communities in the United States live under a persistent fear of being killed by the police. The underlying problem with policing isn't the lack of training and procedures. Providing additional resources to law enforcement agencies for training will not fix the issue. As the policing presence in Black communities expand, so have police budgets, with state and local governments allocating over $100 billion a year to law enforcement. It is time to divest from law enforcement and reinvest in Black and brown communities they unjustly target. And so our panelists tonight, I'm hoping, can lend a little bit of insight into what we're hearing folks on the streets marching, demanding when they say no justice, no peace, defund the police, divest from the police. So I'm going to ask each one of my panelists to introduce themselves. And later on, in about 5-10 minutes into the program, we will be joined by Markasa Tucker, director of the African American Roundtable and Liberate MKE. So I just want to let our viewers know that she will be joining us later in the program. But with that, I'll pass it over to the Queen's sister, Tammy Rivera, to introduce herself, and then followed by the other gentleman.
Buenas tardes. My name is Tammy Rivera. I'm the executive director and lead organizer for Southside Organizing Center. And I'm also the treasurer and the research chair for the Community Collaborative Committee.
Fred Royal, president of Milwaukee Branch of the NAACP, also the co-chair for the Collaborative Community Committee.
Rudy Bankston, restorative justice practitioner, co-founder of Small Fire, and founder of I Am We, coaching and mentor, doing restorative justice work, anti-racist work, particularly in the school system.
Thank you all for joining us. And as I stated early on, I'm hoping that you all can provide a little insight to our viewers as to what is happening in the streets. Why is this energy spreading throughout this country as well as throughout the world? And leading into the question that I have is, how does over-policing in certain communities reinforce the narrative that some communities have more crimes happening than others? And anyone can take that question just to, get us started and open up a dialogue around this issue.
Sean, Sister Queen Markasa has joined us. Can you give her time to introduce herself and
Absolutely.
what she does?
Absolutely.
Hey, y'all.
Markasa.
Fred. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. My name is Markasa Tucker. I'm the director of the African American Roundtable and one of the many co-founders of the Liberate MKE campaign, and soon to be no longer the chair of the CCC, as I am passing the baton to some other beautiful, amazing, brilliant people here in the city. But I'm excited to be here and be a part of this conversation with you all.
Thank you, Markasa, for joining us. And just before someone hop in and answer that question, let me repeat the question so Markasa, you can chime in as well. And basically, I was asking, you know, we're seeing a lot of energy in the streets as well as throughout the world. I mean, a lot of energy in this country as well as throughout the world about folks marching in the streets demanding justice, shouting defund the police. And so the question was, how does over-policing certain communities reinforce the narrative that some communities have more crimes happening than others? And anyone can hop in and answer that question.
Well, one of the overarching mentalities that came in with Chief Flynn was the broken windows theory that stated just because of the vicinity and the area in which you live, that you deserve to be over-policed more so than other communities. Now, just because there's a lack of investment, a lack of resources that are supplied in certain zip codes, that doesn't mean that everybody in that zip code is a criminal and shouldn't be treated as one.
Anyone else want to chime in?
Well, for me, obviously, the more police you have in a geographic area, the more things they're going to notice. And so if you disproportionately have presence in a community, you're going to disproportionately find reasons to stop people, look into things, and by default, run into things. And so it's not a propensity for more things to happen in the inner city or urban environment. It's the likelihood because of the increased presence.
Thank you, Tammy.
I agree. I'm sure there'll be more that I can chime in on.
Absolutely. Thank you both for that. So Tammy and Fred, as well as Markasa, as members of the CCC, the Community Collaborative Committee, and community leaders as well, what do you think real police accountability and transparency looks like?
No police. I mean, that's my first answer. That's probably my only answer, but in the moment while we still have them. So the Fire and Police Commission, which we talk about in Milwaukee being the most powerful civilian board in the country, nobody would know that living in this city or outside of it because they don't operate in their power. A problem we have though with that civilian board is that the mayor gets to control who is appointed to that board. And so the makeup of that board does not represent people who are closest to policing issues. So, you know, there's a former pastor who seems extremely out of touch with what's going on in the city. There is, I think, is Angela a circuit judge or something? Just a lot of these people just are not the ones who are experiencing over policing, let's just be honest. And so I think the Collaborative Community Committee gives community an opportunity to be a part of a bit of accountability. You know, it doesn't have the power that the Fire and Police Commission has, but it's an opportunity for some of the recommendations that they put forward to actually move forward on and to really, as some of us have said, you know, hold the Fire and Police Commission's feet to the fire around what it is that should be happening based on what the community actually wanted.
Yeah, and one of the strongest opportunities I feel that we have heard from the findings of the Department of Justice voluntary collaborative review that Chief Flynn had requested on the Milwaukee Department of Justice come in and look at the Milwaukee Police Department and the Fire Police Commission, was that out of all the themes and responses that we received from the 45 hubs that were conducted, from community groups, was that community-oriented policing was one of the things that they wanted to see implemented within the Milwaukee Police Department. Now, a lot of people may not be familiar with the President Barack Obama's 21st Century Task Force on Policing, which changes the culture. It's an attempt to change the culture and the mindset in police departments from that of a warrior to that of a guardian model, meaning that you are there to assist in developing a safety plan for the community, not to be an occupying force on the citizens of the community.
Thank you. And that's and just to add to that, Fred, because that's what folks are hearing, is, or not necessarily are hearing, but that's what a lot of folks are saying, is that we have an occupying force in our community that has terrorized, traumatized, and you know, in worst case, kill members of our community. So they need to be held accountable when they come into our community, and are tasked with protecting and serving us, but end up killing us, in addition to the continuous traumatization and terrorizing our communities. And we're paying our tax dollars for them to do this, because once they do commit an act of violence against a member of our community, an investigation ensues, and they're still paid while this investigation is ongoing. So as taxpayers, you know, we need to expect, not only expect accountability, but we should be given the certainty that these officers will be held accountable for that violence that they perpetrated and continue to perpetrate it against our community.
And those are some of the policy changes that you can insert in a standard operating procedure that places community-oriented policing as the overarching police model that a Milwaukee Police Department has to operate under, no matter who the sitting chief is. Mm-hmm. So if the sitting chief doesn't come in and follow that standard operating procedure, then that's part of his evaluation, and he can be fired by the Fire and Police Commission, who has that authority to do just that.
And the other good thing about the work that has gone into the CCC in terms of accountability and transparency is that folks are paying a lot more attention, and they've been educated throughout the engagement process. So they're understanding that there are committees at the Common Council that they need to follow, that they have to look at the budget, that they have access to all of these meetings, including the FPC, digitally and in person, that they can speak, that they can ask. And so part of the good part of what's happened during this process is people are increasingly more aware of being able to hold folks accountable by just being present and hearing and involving themselves, so that things don't go into the budget, things don't get purchased, decisions don't get made without the community not knowing about it. And we've seen, especially in recent days, that folks on all levels, elected officials, administrators, and community folks, are able to have put some stops in place and some checks and balances.
Thank you, Tammy. Just pivoting just a little bit, bring Rudy into the conversation. Rudy, here in Milwaukee, there's an organization called Leaders Igniting for Transformation, and they're calling for the removal of MPD out of Milwaukee Public Schools. In fact, I was just down on the lead, and they were out there marching, making those demands. And just last week, I want to say, MTI, Madison Teachers, Inc., released a statement backing the removal of cops out of the schools. Can you talk about how important it is for there to be no cops in schools? And what do you think about MTI backing that, backing the removal of cops from school, given that you used to work in the school district?
I'm not familiar with the Milwaukee organization, but I am familiar with MTI organizations up here, like the Black Educators Network, who I'm a member of. We've pushed MTI to deal with a lot of its own racial history and its own white supremacy within its ranks. One of those ways was to actually call them to support the removal of police from schools. And maybe a week or two before, it's an organization up here, I don't recall it, but it's basically a group of anti-racist white educators, like a group of white educators who've claimed anti-racism as their stance. And they actually sent MTI an email and said, listen, basically to stand in solidarity, particularly with Black and Brown communities, around the racism that MTI's leadership continue to be quiet on. And one of the things they said was we're withdrawing our membership from y'all, and we're going to give it to a local organization, that's a local justice organization, which happens to be Freedom Inc., who's unapologetically anti-police in schools, or the euphemism SROs. And maybe a week later, that's when MTI comes out and backs that. Now, because the white folks are saying, hey, we're about to basically divest in y'all or this organization. But it's a catch. It's a catch to that, because their caveat with backing officers from school is they're demanding that 30 new employees be hired, and those will be unionized positions, and 30 new to replace 4 officers, because it's 4 high schools up here. And it just says so much, because we know on the one end, police are in schools to police Black and brown bodies. And usually there's folks, particularly in the white community, who supports that, because they've been conditioned to feel like Black and brown bodies need to be policed. But it's almost an impossible thing, because right now Madison is going through steep budget cuts, like I imagine most school districts around the country now. So have to be $3.6 to hire these new positions. So, and without these positions, there's no backing. So once again, I just feel like MTI, which unions in general has always been messy with people of color. When they needed our numbers, they came through full throttle. Yeah, we with y'all. But when it's something specific to us that really caused them to put something on the lines, it's often been that portrayal, and it just seems really messy. And the undertone in that is we need 30 people to replace 4 officers in order to support Black and brown students. So I'm not moved at all. If you really back the removal of police officers in school, you wouldn't come with a caveat. You would say, no, this is an oppressive force. And particularly now what's going around the country, how can you think Black and brown students will be psychologically okay being in a building and being greeted by police officers? And you can put Black faces on them, but white supremacy is not a color, it's a mindset. But that's what they did in Madison. They put 4 Black police officers, or 4 police officers of color in the high schools to try to appease that notion that students are unsafe. But that unsafe, and it's heightened now. It's heightened now with all this. So to imagine students of color to go back in these buildings with officers, I don't even think this conversation should be up for discussion anymore, because there is a psychological harm that is being done. So you can put a smile on it or whatever, but it's just great harm. And then it's a large amount of money being funded to the police force that is desperately needed in the school. Like, and it goes again. Right now, Madison School District is doing budget cuts, massive budget cuts. But yet we're still even discussing pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into the police to come, and again, to police Black and brown bodies. I just think to really stand on what you stand for around anti-racist education, that pressure has to be there, and that stance has to be, I think, unapologetic.
Thank you, Rudy. And let me add also that as we speak, the Milwaukee School Board is considering this question right now. So I will be, looking forward to see what they ultimately decide. And as you said, white supremacy, you can put Black faces, in the building, but white supremacy, is a mind frame. In addition to that, just to quote, the rapper Scarface, who said back in the day, you got Black folks in white coats infiltrating the congregation. So just because they're Black doesn't mean that they're not going to cause harm or be dispensing white supremacist tactics.
Yeah. And just being mindful that it doesn't have to be the blatant racism, but white supremacy, it lives in our blood and bones. So you can have a nice face and everything, but I personally experienced within these schools, but now in Madison, where harm was being done, even when two girls are arguing in the ERO, and he's gone now, he bends the corner and just automatically throws one of the young girls in handcuffs. So what that communicates to those, that normalizes arrest and that type of situation to all the other students that there. For the white students, they're being conditioned to think a certain way. To the black students who are seeing this teenage, their peer being in handcuffs, that normalizes for them. So it's not always just the officer coming in the room, the classroom, and snatching the child, the student out, or the arrest, but it's just that messaging that that states, and everybody, I feel, is aware on a conscious or subconscious level that officers in there to police black and brown bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And let's not forget that what our youth are seeing is a no-win situation of confusion. Because just even locally in Milwaukee, what have they seen? They've seen that you can be invited to a police party of a friend and be killed. You can be sleeping in a park, have mental health issues, and be murdered. You can be stopped, illegally searched, as Fred shared earlier in an interview that we had today, raped, illegal cavity searches when you're cooperating with the police. Mm-hmm. And then they've seen nationally, even if the police could show up because they think you have false currency, for $20 you could be killed. You could fall asleep at your car, killed. You could be jogging, killed. You could be sleeping in your house, killed. You could cooperate and subdue, still killed. And so now there's no win. Now, in kids' mind, how many basketball games with police officers would you have to participate in to erase all of that? How many hot dogs at a barbecue in Milwaukee Park would you have to have with a police officer to make up for all of that? Because we do have good cops. And now we have a dilemma because we've been pushing for local people to become cops. And so we have people who are local people becoming cops. How are they supposed to behave in the environment? I have a niece and nephew in the police force now. So it's like mass confusion, mass distrust, and it feels like a no-win situation because of all those circumstances. That's the messages these babies are getting. What do you do? What do you do when you encounter a police?
Yeah. And
you run?
Stop. Thank you, Tammy, for lifting that up, and just, to honor Joel Acevedo by saying his name. That is what we're calling for. Is accountability. We're calling for accountability to be had for this man's family and for our community. So I just wanted to say his name, along with the countless others men and women who have died at the hands of law enforcement, as well as our children, because our children are on the other end, on the receiving end of this violence. So they're killing essentially whole families in the Black and brown community. And going back to, since I have 3 members of the Community Collaborative Committee on hand, I'm very privileged right now. I have 1,000 questions for you all, but the Milwaukee Fire and Police Commission might move consideration of a new use of force policy to early July. Will the Community Collaborative Committee be part of this process? In addition to the SOP, Standard Operating Procedure 460, on the use of force? And do you know if they will consider how the use of force policy affects crowd control, dispersal tactics, especially in this moment of daily demonstrations, SOP 910. And we know that Milwaukee Police Department has used tear gas and rubber bullets in previous weeks. So I'll ask that if you all.
That was a lot, Sean. Those were a lot of SOPs. I'm like, wait a minute. Right? we catch all of those. I'm trying to pull up our report. There are very specific SOPs that the collaborative committee are going to be working around. Specifically, there is the one around use of force. So the community definitely was interested in seeing some changes around that. I am trying to pull up that report.
I have them here. I have it here in the PowerPoint presentation, the SOPs that were addressed specifically, because we said, in addition to the Department of Justice findings and the ACLU law settlement, SOP 085, 300, 440, 450, 737, 47, 990, 135, 70, 500. And we'll have to find the details of those SOPs in the full report. But that 990 is the one that you're referring to, Sean?
910 and
910 wasn't specifically named in the top ones that we did yet, because we only got through half.
Yeah, and I would also say as well, like that's another opportunity for the collaborative committee. So I know that it has those very specific things that they wanted to work on, and we wanted to really prioritize them, because those are the things that the community asked for. But I can't imagine that this would not be an opportunity for the CCC to engage themselves in those conversations, and that we should be the group that they are able to come to for information to connect back to the community, since again, the Fire and Police Commission is not really connected to the community, and people that will be on the CCC will likely be.
Absolutely. So when the mayor started talking about convening a special commission to look at the use of force, there were 8 specific areas of use of force that he wanted to utilize. We were concerned because we didn't want the work that we had been doing to get lost in this new heightened awareness of use of force. Because you know politics, it's the latest and hottest topic of the day that folks like to draw attention to. But changing the culture of MPD is one of the greatest things, the greatest opportunities that is coming out of this discussion nationally, changing the mentality of law enforcement from the warrior to the guardian. Now, certainly the CCC is the best equipped committee to conduct the same type of survey scan of the community to feel how they feel or give input to the use of force policies, and 910, how to deal with demonstrations. We should be having these conversations continually on how to establish a safety plan in collaboration with law enforcement, not in silos. That's how you build community trust. But I wanted to go just back just briefly to mention about the cancellation of the contract with law enforcement and MPD, and MPS. One of the things I hope that they look at is their policy 8.26, which is weapons and criminal conduct behavior. Because that's how we get our babies into the school to prison pipeline. As my brother said, we talk about how we normalize behavior. When I was growing up, having a fight was a fight. It wasn't battery. It wasn't extortion. If you bully somebody out their lunch money, our babies are getting classified as being extortionists, as being rapists, as being conducting battery with intent to harm. 7 grams of marijuana is intent to deliver. You can have 25 grams and be a municipal citation if you've grown. So we have to stop criminalizing the behavior that is, if you were a European American, would be just youthful ignorance. And I think some of that money should be going to restorative justice procedure. Right now we just have restorative justice practice. It should be a policy that children come in and have an opportunity to decompress, and they should be decompressing around peer groups.
Mm-hmm. And just naming that, with that restorative justice piece, adults need that too.
Okay.
Like, I see more harm come through adults' broken relationships and education than anywhere else. And it trickles down to young people. But I think often today, when people think of restorative justice, they're thinking of it from a reactive standpoint versus a proactive, where how do you come in and begin to build community? How do you come in and begin to shift mindsets around how education is being done? And one of the restorative justice piece comes in because the components of it, and how me and the folks that I draw with, we practice it through an anti-racist lens. And it starts with building strong and healthy relationships, creating just and equitable learning environments, and transforming conflict and repairing harm. And those three components guide the work, but at the very top is building strong relationships. And that's relationships between adults, relationship between adults and students, and relationships between adults, students, and parents. Because you're in this system, if the educators fear the students, they fear the parents. And if there's no collaboration between those three, it's going to continue to break down. But education is not investing what it needs to invest in those type of I don't like to say program, but it's a way to build those type of cultures within school settings, because it's just easy to just remove, to call the police, to intimidate with law enforcement, versus you need to go build a relationship, not only with that child, but with that student, but with the parents too, because those parents have been also I don't think people talk about that history enough, similar to not having a conversation about the history of why police are in school and where did that really start, and who did that really start with.
To touch back on the question about use of force, there were 17 points in the CCC report that related to use of force, and that also aligned with the Department of Justice finding Chapter 5 on use of force, just to help people sort of locate those things.
Thank you, Tammy. So we know that, so here in America, there are over 10 million arrests, 10.5 million arrests a year annually. That breaks down to an arrest every 3 seconds. So 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, someone just was arrested. So we know that the first point of contact with law enforcement, with policing, is an expressway into our criminal legal system, into the Department of Corrections. So my question to you all, if you all would like to speak to this, is how can rethinking and or defunding policing reverse the mass incarceration epidemic, specifically here in Wisconsin, where we are sitting right now with over 23,000 people in our state prisons and another 11 to 12,000 in our county jails. How can defunding the police have a impact on mass incarceration?
Absolutely. That means that nobody's going to jail because there aren't any police, right? And people are asking the question, you know, we keep talking about defunding the police, but what are you talking about building? You know, we have to recognize that prisons and policing has been built over generations and generations and generations. So no, the answer is just not going to come. The system and the new structure is just not going to come. But Rudy was hitting on some of those things. You know, we have to create different systems and different processes on how we actually work and build with people around restorative justice opportunities. We know that there needs to be some sort of accountability around things, but we also know that when people are going to the cage, there's usually some underlying cause. There's usually some root cause. There's people we know that are sitting in prisons today who possibly just needed mental health services, who possibly needed some, drug rehabilitation, and instead they're sitting in a cage. And so that we know that as we are defunding policing, we're also looking to invest and fund things that will actually support and help those people. So we know that those systems and those new structures are going to take years to build, but that's why we have to start this conversation right now so that we won't have to talk about people in cages.
Thank you, Markasa.
I think if people take the time to actually read the Office of Violence Prevention 414 plan, that the top three suggestions in reducing violence is to address the lack of resources that are in communities. So when you look at some of the reasons people commit crimes, it's either crimes of passion, crimes of necessity, crimes of opportunity. And as Sister Queen stated, we have some mental health issues that need to be addressed. So what we're hoping is that folks will get at the table, and this is the beauty of community-oriented policing, is that we give law enforcement incentives for addressing the criminogenic behavior, of figuring out what's causing people to get into criminogenic behavior and coming up with solutions to that in collaboration with the resources that are available at the community. So this is an all-in, like I said, this type of thinking of law enforcement is a collective safety plan for our community, which everybody has to be a part of.
Thank you, Fred. Tammy, Rudy, y'all want to add to that? You're muted.
I would ditto what has been said, but if we want to look at in terms of policing and presence and results, the 10% cut that was recommended by the Common Council recently of 29.7 or 10% of the budget means the police put out on Twitter that it would mean losing 375 police positions, right? Stay with me, folks, for a little math. That means it costs us about $79,200 per police officer. If we look at the full budget of $297 million, and we divided it by that 79 per cop, that means we have 3,750 police positions. Our population is 590,157. I know, like, I'm a nerd, so just stick with me, okay? Just stick with me, because I like to look at facts when we examining things, which means we have one cop for every 157 residents here. Now, that includes babies, but we don't need cops to be copping toddlers. You know what I'm saying? And so now we're talking about one cop for what, half of that? 75 people. And so if we can't get it right like that, something's wrong. Like, we need to analyze this problem from a lot of ways and holistically. And that's just one way that I was like, I'm curious. What would that mean? That would mean one cop for every, maybe I have my math wrong. I'll do it again. But
Nah, do that math, Tammy. Do that math.
And
we need to look at that as we make decisions and as we try to have a genuine partnership with elected officials in the police department. And I'm like, let's really look at it, not just bunker in our holes and say our way. Let's look at it all different kinds of ways. If we can't police this city, one to every 75 people with the money we're doing, some got to change. In addition to the Alderman Jose Perez shared with us, it's not sustainable. The amount of money that we're pouring into police is not, money is finite. It is not sustainable. He said we have a balloon payment in 2023 to the police union that could bankrupt the city. Now, come on now. Let's come to the table realizing it ain't working. It's not sustainable. In addition to all the moral, social, spiritual reasons why things should change.
Thank you, Tammy. And we have a question from one of our Facebook viewers, and they asked, do the panelists have any insight on the role of police unions in impeding accountability in Milwaukee or Madison?
Yes, yes. I mean, the police union is one of the most powerful forces in this state, and absolutely, they are looking to, keep their people in jobs by any means necessary. They lobby to make sure that state statutes are what they are, so that when cops like Officer Mattioli murders Joel Acevedo, they get to keep their jobs even when they've been charged, and they get to still be on pay. And so while our people are here, taking the streets, we're doing these other initiatives, we have a gap where we're not able to go and lobby and say, actually, we don't want that state statute. We don't want cops to continue to get paid after they've murdered people. Absolutely not. So there's a gap around our work, and we recognize that. But absolutely, police unions are a part of all of those semantics, just like they're a part of all the semantics, even with the Fire and Police Commission. There was a piece of legislation a couple years ago where they wanted to ensure former cops and former firefighters were a part of the most, powerful civilian board, our Fire and Police Commission. And it didn't necessarily go through, but there was a lot of pressure on Mayor Tom Barrett, and maybe it wasn't, because maybe he just wanted us to have I don't know. But there was some pressure because there was some legislation. And so now on our civilian board, there is a former police officer and a former firefighter. And that's not by our doing. That's because of some of the work that's going on the back end by police unions.
Thank you, Markasa. Anyone else? Okay, so we're coming up on a 7:30 hour. We probably got about 17, 18 more minutes in the program. And so I'm going to ask each one of my panelists to, just say a few remarks about, what we're seeing in the streets with what our young people marching, demanding justice, in calling and working to dismantle white supremacy, racism. Anyone can start, but I want to tie in your last remarks, and I want to ask Markasa, or let me step back a little bit. So Tammy just mentioned that there was the MPD mentioned that they would be losing 375 officers if there was a 10% cut in their budget, and they have this hashtag, did you know? And so I want to say hashtag, did you know that the African American Roundtable and Liberate MKE, along with over 50, or correct me if I'm wrong, Markasa, 50 or more organizations here in the city representing the community in which they are tasked to serve and protect, have signed on to a demand and acts of $75 million to be divested from the police budget into community resources. Hashtag, did you know, MPD? So I'm going to ask my panelists to wrap us up with a few remarks about the protests that we're seeing in the streets, and how could we capitalize off this moment? Why is this moment important? And in closing, Markasa, I would love for you to talk about the goals of the Liberate MKE campaign and how folks can get involved.
So let me try and start. What this moment in time is definitely historic. It's historic on unfortunate circumstances, but we have never seen over the course of the 62 years of my lifetime, when the crowds that were rioting were so mixed racially, ethnically, diversity in age, diversity in the locations in which the protests are occurring. So I think it's an opportunity to really have, as Eric Holder stated, the courageous conversation on race that this country has never had. I think we are having that now. And I think that's the opportunity that's presented to us right now. And we just can't look at it through the lens of correcting the systemic racism that's been going on in policing. We have to look at it holistically. As COVID-19 has pulled the scab off the disparities in healthcare in this country, and we see the alarming rate in which minorities are dying from this pandemic because of the systemic racism within the healthcare systems. And that also trickles down into the disparities in the housing, disparities in the employment opportunities, because we are those essential workers. So I think it's an opportunity to look at systemic racism in this country in its totality.
What do I think is happening now? The babies are doing it. They're doing the sacrificial work of staying on the line. They're growing exponentially. They're reacting to all those things that I told you. There's not, in Spanish, we have a saying that says, no me cabe en mi alma. It doesn't fit in my soul what is happening. I cannot take that in, so I'm going to push it back out. And they're demanding from us, elected officials, administrators, society as a whole, like, we're not accepting no progress. So, and all the things Fred said, there's no retreat here, there's only breakthrough. And so how do we want to land this plane? We want to crash land it, or we want to smooth land it? Let's land it on everybody's account. And I'm not just polarizing and vilifying. I'm saying for everybody in society. The other thing I just want to leave folks with is, we learn from history. History exists. We cyclical human beings. So we have not had change in this country without a couple of components. The foremost component has been unrest, because unfortunately the other components haven't been able to cross the finish line because people don't take them seriously, which are, anytime civil rights, social justice, the right thing has happened, has included legislation, litigation, economic pressures to or from, which we haven't even started in Milwaukee yet. And the pivotal fourth component that, if that's not present, doesn't happen, is unrest. So when you condition a country that the only way you're going to get change is unrest, because you won't do it, we won't get it with legislation, we won't get it with litigation, and sometimes it's not embargo, that's what you're going to get. And so here we are, and we will have a breakthrough.
Thank you, Tammy. Rudy?
I just think the soul wounds are opening up and begging for healing right now. And it's not just in America, it's around the country. And like the sister Tammy said, I cannot think of any time in history where there's been revolutionary change and there's not been chaos. Because change has to come when everybody gets uncomfortable. But there's a caution in this too, because we gotta also hold those who are posing as allies accountable, so they won't make this thing some type of pandemic pastime. And then when football season comes back, and baseball season and basketball season comes back, it's a return to normal. And that's more so to make sure we know what we gotta do to keep pushing forward. And I really appreciate that lens around recognizing what role does white supremacy play. If we are not approaching this thing through an anti-racist lens, the sister, she wrote Justice on Maisha Wynn. She talks about 4 pedagogical stances in education, and she says history matters, justice matters, language matters, and race matters. And we taking those 4 pedagogical stances as we move through this will be critical, because if we don't understand, if we don't keep an eye on how oppression will show back up in a new form once something else is done away with, and that's what has happened over and over again. But I think the young people are speaking now, and and salutes to them. And it's like in when those causes come, we had the civil rights movement and they did it a certain way, kudos to them. But then we had the Black Power movement and other movements across racial lines. But it's always going to also be that generation to criticize the younger generation, and which also causes divide. But I continue to think and believe that this had to happen. And I think a movement is being built, and I think we're at a moment we're at a moment right now that's exploding into a movement on multiple levels. And I just hope we can continue to interrogate everything, even the best sounding ideas, but also to keep pushing forward and to radically reimagine how we can live in this country. I'm talking about, because a lot of stuff is being institutionalized and weaponized against folks too, including restorative justice. So just really continuing to interrogate everything along the way, but also tap into that energy and push, you know?
Thank you, Rudy.
Yeah.
And last but not least, certainly not least, the Queen Sister, Markasa Tucker.
Yeah, amazing information. You know, I'm so glad that we were able to share with the ACLU family. And so I'm excited. Like, people are saying, like, you know, oh, you know, what's different about this moment? I said, you know, we've just leveled up. Like, we've been protesting and doing this kind of stuff forever. Like, this is not the first time you've seen people taking the streets, but it's such an exciting momentum and waves to be on, because we are talking about things that our ancestors, you know, could not even imagine. You know, we're talking about defunding the police, and that is not right. That's a message that is carrying all over the country and in some places in different parts of the world. And so for that to be on the agenda across the country is the most exciting thing that I could say is happening right now, outside of me being able to breathe. And so I'm excited to see, like Tammy said, the young people. I'm excited to hear about the conversations of what it looks like to take time to be able to reimagine what those things are, because I don't think that we take enough time. We're so busy in movement and motion and reaction and strategy and planning that we don't stop to say, wait a minute. We need to stop and actually imagine what these alternatives look like outside of the system. Like Rudy said, you know, we can't allow people to co-opt and institutionalize the things that we know are going to keep us safe, because we know once white supremacy gets its hand in it, that it's a wrap. So we have to create our own, and we have to create spaces so that that can happen as well. So for folks who are interested in Liberate MKE and our $75 million defund ask, we can be reached at liberatemke@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook. We have a Liberate MKE group that you can be invited to, or you can follow the African American Civic Engagement Roundtable page. If you are interested in signing on to our new campaign that we are in the middle of launching this week, we just got done doing the history of policing right before this actual call. You can go to our Facebook page and check out the video from tonight. That was at 5:30, and check out the video from yesterday where we really talked about the campaign. But you can also, again, just go on our website, liberatemke.com, sign up to be on the email list, or let us know that you want to be down and want to be a part of this campaign. We'll be going through some educational trainings throughout the summer and surveying people to ask them, where do they want that $75 million to go? We've already said that we want to make sure that $50 million is going back into public health initiatives. We can't have a city where our health department is getting less than 3%. It's unacceptable. And like Tammy was saying, these things are unsustainable. Our people can't live and thrive with those type of opportunities. And then we'll also be doing educating around how to lobby, how to tell your story as we continue to move through the city's budget cycle. So thanks again, Sean, for having us on.
Thank you, Markasa. And just real quickly before we end, I want to remind folks that we do have over 23,000 people in our state prisons who have been sentenced to essentially a civic death. We have, again, over 12,000 people in our county jails, and the ACLU is continuing to work on behalf of these individuals and advocate for them to be released back into our community. Given that we're in a global pandemic, we're asking the governor to use his executive authority to begin releasing folks through commutations, compassionate release, and also to direct his Secretary of the Department of Corrections to begin thinking about ways in which they can release folks expeditiously, because we are in a global pandemic, and this deadly virus can spread pretty rapidly in a correctional setting. And so we're asking folks to go to our website and sign our petition. This is the last week for our petition, with the last day being the 21st. We're asking you to sign our petition, share our petition, asking the governor and putting pressure on the governor to stop a prison pandemic. We're also asking folks to utilize our sheriff toolkit. Sheriffs are elected officials. You can find your sheriff by Googling your county name plus the sheriff. It will take you to a website with the contact info, and you can use our sheriff toolkit to send a letter to the sheriff asking him or her to decarcerate, to reduce their jail population, because again, this deadly virus can spread in congregate environments. This is a communicable disease, and it can have deadly results. As we have saw in our own community, many close friends and family members have died as a result of this virus. So let's continue to advocate for our brothers and sisters who are held behind enemy lines, who are within our Department of Corrections. And let's hold our governor accountable to the promise that he made on the campaign trail. And let's also hold our sheriffs accountable, who are elected officials and who will be campaigning for your vote. We have these town halls every Wednesday. Please join us next week at 6:30. Our guest is yet to be confirmed, but I assure you, you will want to tune in. I give you a hint. It may be a cheesehead. But anyway, thank you to all of my panelists. I appreciate you. I appreciate your words, your insights, and onwards and upwards. Let's get free. Thank you to our viewing audience. Continue to follow us on all social media platforms, and continue to, volunteer with the ACLU and these other organizations who are out here on the ground doing the work. Thank you. Have a great night and be blessed.